This is the Chicks of FinTwit, a finance podcast by women for everyone. I am your host, Caitlin Cook. Join me as I highlight female trailblazers and their male allies across the industry as each shares their expertise on a variety of finance topics. Nothing is off limits. Thanks for joining us. Now please enjoy this episode.
All opinions expressed by Caitlin Cook and the Chicks of FinTwit podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of the host or any of their affiliates. This podcast is for informational purposes only, is not investment advice, and should not be relied upon for any investment decisions. We are not recommending any securities, nor is this an offer or sale of a security.
Hello and welcome to the Chicks of FinTwit podcast, a finance podcast by women for everyone. I'm your host, Caitlin Cook, otherwise known as Dead Kate Bounce to some on Twitter. And with me today, I have Linda Lebrun, a writer recruitment at Substack, otherwise known as Substack Linda. Linda, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. Thanks so much for inviting me. It's wonderful to chat with you today.
Exciting to see people that you've followed along with on podcasts and Twitter and things face to face here, even if virtually. So super excited. Definitely want to get a bit into, all kinds of things when it comes to Substack here. But first, maybe let's just start with your background. I saw you have a background in more traditional finance and just curious what led you to Substack to begin with. And also for those listening to the podcast right now who aren't familiar, a little bit of a primer on what Substack is.
Yeah, 100%. I'll start with the second question first on what Substack is. So Substack is a platform that lets anybody start a free or paid email newsletter. And email newsletters are not new, but what's new about it is how easy it makes it. So Substack was founded 4 years ago by three founders who they went through Y Combinator and they really had an idea of wanting to be a lifeboat for journalists. That was the genesis of it. You wanted to be able to say, if a journalist is laid off or wishes to become independent and they wanted to go and start their own publication, it was really hard. It was tough to monetize a blog. People were doing things like using a PayPal tip jar. There weren't a lot of good solutions. So what they did was just invent something where you, as one person on your own, can go and start sending out an email newsletter. You also get a beautiful archive, and then you can charge money. You can charge people subscriptions. So with a subscription product, as the finance people listening to this will appreciate, you can actually, with recurring revenue, plan your life and have a business. So that was their idea. So, and this relates to how I came to Substack. So this was successful and they started to get some traction and people were coming and starting on Substack and building up meaningful size incomes and businesses on it. And then, of course, what happened is what always happens, which is finance people discover it. So I knew a couple of people who were either formerly in the investment business or they took taking a break from the investment business, and they were writing and they started writing on Substack. And they set up a paywall, and it really worked well for them. Like it was stunning that, okay, these guys appear to have figured something out. They've made a technical solution that allow people to, on their own, no hiring developers, no sitting there trying to figure out the HTML, that it just works. So I was, like you said, I was working in the investment business, and I was casting about for something new. The people who are listening to this who are in their 40s might be able to relate a little bit better, because when you're mid-career, sometimes you feel like, oh, I've been doing the same thing for 15 years. There's a lot of routine. In investing, there is always something new to learn, but I was starting to feel, frankly, a little burned out. And when you feel burned out, the right thing to do is probably the seat should be for someone else, and you should find something that excites you. And I was excited by this idea. So I contacted one of the founders of Substack, Hamish McKenzie, and really just pitched myself and said, you guys have been solving these problems for journalists, and I think there's a lot you can do in the world of finance, investing, economics, crypto for that type of writer. You're a solution for them too, but you might have to think about approaching that market a bit differently. And I've been reading blogs about investing for 15 years, and I know all about it. You know, when you promote yourself, you say, I am the expert in this. And I approached him that way, and he was willing to chat. And one thing led to another, and I came into this role. And it's been very refreshing. It was really the right thing to go out of something where I was feeling worn out and into something where it was like, okay, here's a big challenge, a big apple to bite into. And the people I have had the opportunity to meet, the writers themselves are absolutely phenomenal. So that's that is the story of what Substack is in simplified form. And that's the story of how I came to be in it.
Beautiful. And I think there's a lot to dig in there. And I think this is perfect timing, right? With you're joining Substack, right? I mean, I think the term creator economy is a little bit overused at this point, but it is true. We've seen so many people going independent with their businesses, going off on their own and really just creating something for themselves and trying to figure out how to monetize that. But I do kind of want to shift into talking more specifically about the finance side of Substack, right? Like for within finance and writing research and whatnot, I feel like from institutional grade research perspective, there's always been a bit of gatekeeping around that, right? And a lot of regulatory oversight, understandably, for those writing research at bigger firms. So in a lot of ways, I'd have to assume that Substack sort of eliminates that for a lot of people who don't necessarily want to fit into that more overseen, regulated, kind of gate-kept framework and go out on their own to write about what they really want to write about without restriction.
Yeah, big time. I think big opportunity, there are a few opportunities, but one big opportunity is that the world of sell-side research it's getting disrupted, and it's been disrupted before the challenge from various newsletter platforms. It was disrupted by MiFID and unbundling, and that was more in the European framework. But even in the US, there's a fear and a concern of, can research pay for itself within investment banks? Does it pay for itself? Research has always been kind of an add-on, and it's really the investment banking that pays. So the minute you start to try to comb out who's paying for what and start to feel like, well, we have to be more strict about what client commissions pay for, there starts to be a challenge to the research departments. So things have been very much changed in Europe, where there was a phenomenon where there was much less research coverage of small cap stocks, for example, because MiFID. In the US, there hasn't been a regulatory change like that. But what I find is the challenge maybe on the sell side in the US, or where I'm hopeful anyway, that there could be people who would come from the sell side to Substack, is the lifestyle issues. The lifestyle of a sell side analyst is exceedingly intense. It's long hours. And the irony is, a lot of people, they get in the investment business because they love capital markets. They like to look at stocks. They love nothing more than to sit there on a Saturday night reading a 10K. But what happens if they're on the buy side is they spend their whole life marketing and trying to gather assets. And if they're on the sell side, they spend their whole life talking to clients and traveling around with companies. You tend to, the further you rise and the better you get, more and more you get pulled away from the thing that made you love it in the first place. Now, we're talking about some very well-compensated roles. So it's harder if somebody wants to be independent, for them to compensate for that than it is for somebody who, say, is a local journalist and trying to build up a Substack and to replace that income. So it might be hard, but what we've seen is, increasingly I see people coming on Substack who are former hedge fund managers, former analysts who have a background in that and have just said, well, I want to make a choice. I no longer want to have the handcuffs of compliance on how I trade my own portfolio. I want to really be more like a journalist and not talk about every quarter if there's not something to say about the quarter, but to really talk about my variant view. And that's been exciting to me. I think it's just sort of in the first inning and just starting. And it has to be a person who is willing to take the risk of doing something entrepreneurial, because you're betting on yourself rather than being within a corporate environment. Of course, a corporate environment doesn't have any guarantees either. So in some ways, you may not be reducing the risk as much as you think to go out on your own and build something on your own.
For sure. And I think just with the shift we've seen towards more of an entrepreneurial mindset, people going off and creating content on their own, sort of a double-edged sword where there's just such a saturation of content out there.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to monetizing, I mean, I have quite a few questions around this, but for those who do decide to go off on their own, right? What's the, I guess, how do you, in a world of so many distractions in this creator economy that's continuing to grow and everyone bringing their ideas to the forefront, how do you grab attention? How do you get signups? How do you truly successfully monetize something like that?
Yeah, that is so much the central question, because there is no, if you build it, they will come. There's no automatic audience that you get, no switch that anybody can flip where people are going to pay attention to you. And you see this on every social media site. It's a perennial fight to the death for attention. So Substack, when we created Substack, it was to be something distinct from that, where we would say, if you come to Substack and build your own thing and have your own email list, we will not be elbowing in between you and the person who signs up for your email. We will not show them ads. We will not give them 18 other things to read. It's going to be between you and them. So that's positive because you own that relationship. But the negative there is, well, aren't you going to promote my stuff to other people's audiences? Well, no, because we're making the same promise to everybody. So it still leaves people with the marketing and promotion question in their lap to figure out. So when we talk to Substack writers about how to approach this, and people have very different tactics, the tactics are all over the place, but a lot of it is classic marketing strategy, which is if you go on a podcast like this and do it regularly. I have talked to Substack writers, and they tell me that when they go on a podcast, there's a kink in the graph of their reader base. So, go on podcasts. You don't have to get on, the biggest one that there is. If you have a small audience and find a podcaster with a small audience, the cross-pollination of audiences is highly effective. Another thing people do is cross-pollination with other newsletter audiences. So if you have 350 subscribers and you find somebody else in a similar topic area with 420 subscribers, that's a great opportunity for you guys to do guest posts for each other, boost each other. So nothing I'm saying is any great innovation to anyone, to go and say, make a Twitter thread about your Substack post. This is, it's not going to blow anybody's minds. It's sort of marketing 101, but it's really the consistency that is what succeeds for people. So you'd be amazed talking to some of the Substack writers who've been on there for years and are really known to be very successful. When you ask for advice, the two biggest things they say are niche down, get more focus on what you're doing and don't try to be a generalist, and have consistency. If you're going to do it every week, week in and week out, even when it's a grind, even when you feel like you have nothing to write about, and the benefits come from there. So again, nothing that is going to surprise anyone, but it's been compelling how often I've heard those pieces of advice repeated.
Yeah. And that, I guess, I don't have a Substack. I don't write in that capacity, but in terms of ever getting questions around content creation and what works and what doesn't, in terms of building an audience, keeping an audience and keeping them entertained and whatnot, I feel like consistency is one of the easiest and hardest things to do. It sounds so simple. It's such a simple idea where you just continuously show up every day and are providing content and interacting. But I would say, one of my questions was going to be, how do you continuously wow your readership if they're paying? If they're paying for content, right? I think it almost can sometimes be, first off, that consistency element of it, showing up at a time that your reader is expecting for you to show up and always delivering content at that time. Mm-hmm. And then I was also going to ask in terms of, the content itself, what have you seen that works more than, what works more of the time than doesn't, I guess. I know you mentioned sort of getting niche down, but if you can expand on that, that would be great.
Yeah, for sure. And when it comes to that consistency thing, it's like you do it. It's like how you make friends, not if you go to a place once, but if you go to the same place over and over and they know to expect it from you. Like when you go on your Twitter and you do a video educating about a crypto topic, and I see that. And then the next time I see in a couple of weeks, I see you do it again. And then I see you do it a third time. All right, now I know that when I go to your Twitter, you're going to be the person where I receive some education in a mode different than what I'm getting. Everybody else does a thread and you're doing something different. So by doing that over and over again, it's a real invitation to the audience to say, pay attention, and you're going to be able to always get something useful here. So, and when it comes to the niche down thing, it was so funny. I saw somebody do a tweet. This isn't even a Substack writer, but I loved the insight and remembered it. He said, don't write a newsletter for bodybuilders saying what bodybuilders should eat. Write it for vegetarian bodybuilders on a budget. That's really what it is, because the more you think that you're making something broad so that you'll have a big audience paying attention, it really just diffuses it into that Niagara Falls of content that you mentioned, where we're all in the Unreal Tournament again. You'd rather bring it, the best writers, I think, bring it down. And so I always have writers ask me about whether their expertise will sell on Substack. Like they'll say, well, what if I want to do Eastern European small cap stocks? Or what if I want to do this, this specific area of commodities that happens to be what I have 20 years of experience in? And often I have to say to them, I can't give you an example of someone who's doing that, but you could be the category creator, because if you can if I can ask you, are there, a couple thousand people in the English speaking world who would be into paying for what you're doing? Well, yeah, there probably would. Okay. Well, you have to go find them, and to find them, you have to start. So the niching down thing, and now you asked about what's the content that people really like and are really going to be fine worth paying for. A beneficial thing about a reason why I really like this vertical of finance and investing is because information that's in furtherance of a trade, information that somebody could use to make money, there's a far higher propensity to pay, and the demand is inelastic, I would say. So people are often willing to pay more than you might think for it. It's more challenging so if I had a Substack that was sort of about my reflections and memories and personal stuff, okay, my friends and family might be into that, but I'm not a celebrity. Unless I were a brilliant writer, the applicability and people's willingness to pay would be less. But if you have, information that is actionable in some way, and again, it doesn't even have to be stock picking, because there are a lot of people very successfully doing written content online that they're selling that's about macro, endless appetite for macro commentary. But it's to help them make money at work, make money in their portfolio. So there is what I would, if people are thinking of doing this, I guess I'd invite them to reflect and say, how can I make what I am talking about more actionable? And people are then going to find it more worth paying for.
That's such a great point. And especially when it comes to money, right? I feel like the eyes just light up. So any way that someone can try to monetize what they're already doing, or grow income, or create a new stream of income, or just improve their investment skills, if you're talking about finance specifically, I mean, it makes a lot of sense that someone would be willing to kind of shell out of their pocketbooks, even of a small amount every month for that. Mm-hmm. And sort of as a follow-up around, you'd be surprised at how much people would pay for certain types of content. I've had this conversation with some, creators in the finance space before. And I think there's got to be this big challenge, or at least it seems from the outside, on actually monetizing, not even the process of it itself, but actually determining what that work is worth. So how do you, whether it's you or the team at Substack, does the Substack team help people with determining how, at what price they monetize their content, or is that entirely independent for each person that is signing up for Substack?
It is each writer's choice, but I can tell you that it is one of the most common questions that people on my team and I get asked, what should I charge? And people are asking because there is not that much benchmarking information available. If I make jam at home and want to know how much jam should cost, I can go to the store and see what the jam costs and know that I shouldn't charge $25 for my jam, unless it's the best jam in the world. But when you're doing a newsletter, people can go to the leaderboards on Substack. So if you go to substack.com, there's a list of categories on the right-hand side. And if you say, well, mine's going to be about finance, click on finance, and you can see what the other top finance publications are charging. And you can say, okay, well, I see that there is a publication by Barry Knapp, who is a macro strategist. He used to work at Guggenheim, and he has Ironsides Macro, which is his Substack, and he's charging $89 a month. And then I can see that there might be some other Substacks. There are a lot that are around a $15 price point. So is mine more like his? Is mine more like the $15 ones? I would say that, like we just discussed, finance information does bear a higher price. Sometimes because finance people are very quantitative, they say to me, can't you give me a chart that shows the correlation between the price people charge and how fast their Substack grows? And I'm sort of like, technically, I could make that, but it would be so deceptive because there's no such thing as the newsletter audience. There's no such thing as the Substack audience. There's only your audience. And so if you have Barry Knapp's audience, you can charge a higher price because he's well known and he has the depth, versus if you are somebody who is maybe not as well known, maybe you're still on your learning journey, maybe you might want to charge $15, and because you will appreciate every subscriber who you get, because you're going to get as much as them in terms of their questions, their comments, their suggestions to you, their, hey, have you looked at, as they are from you. So yeah, it's tough because pricing is one of the toughest questions in any business. It's very hard to put a pin in it and get it exactly right. So there's a tension there, but at the same time, part of the underpinning philosophy of Substack is good writing is worth paying for. I can tell you when the mythology of the starting Substack, when they were starting it, many people pushed back and said, people have been trained not to pay for writing online. Nobody will pay. So the pushback was nobody will pay. What we have seen is people will pay if they feel a connection to the writer and if it's quality information. So it's something that, people do have to sit with a bit and think about. What's the how actionable is the information? What kind of cadence am I willing to put it out? Is it going to be my full-time job or a part-time thing? All of these questions are going to feed into what kind of prices is the best price to charge.
And going on kind of audience-wise, right? It makes sense if you're coming from, a larger financial firm and you're deciding to go out on your own and you start a Substack. You already have that audience sort of built in, or people that you can go to share that work with. If you don't have a social media following, right, or you don't have that industry background where you're very well known and have that audience built in, how do people market themselves? I know you mentioned going onto podcasts, but are there any other specific things that people do to get the word out there about what they're writing?
Yeah, if people are starting from scratch, I would say they should put on a campaign by any avenue that will work for them. We all love making fun of LinkedIn. But a lot of people look at LinkedIn every day, and there are a lot of professionals who have the 500 plus. They have a lot of LinkedIn contacts. Everybody they ever went to school with, worked with. If people are like that, they say, oh, I don't have Twitter. Do you have LinkedIn? Yeah, I have lots of people on LinkedIn. You can use your LinkedIn and post your Substack information there. When you do a post, promote yourself. Usually the next part of the conversation is when people come from the conventional finance world, they often have a block about self-promotion. Okay. The kind of person who is the drama club person. Were you in drama club? Did you ever do plays and things like that when you were in school?
I didn't, but I was in band.
Okay. So you were in band. So if you have some kind of a background in performance, you kind of appreciate that when the moment comes to be on stage and shine, you just do it and you can't hide your light under a bushel. But a lot of people who are the more quantitative, linear, they may be very bright and engaging people, but the thought of sign up for my Substack and pay for it makes them feel kind of sick. So they have to get over that and be creative and think about how they're going to go out and do it. So if they should use what they have. If that's Twitter, if that's LinkedIn, if that's something else, they should go ahead and use that. I also, tell people to not underestimate their own personal friends and family contacts. Most of us, when you're starting out, most of us could sweep up together probably 100 names of friends, family, people we worked with. If you push yourself and just say, you're trying to begin that compounding process. It's like, the first billion is the hardest. It's at the beginning that it feels really insurmountable and you feel kind of scared. I don't want to tell all these people of what I'm doing. I want a soft launch, which means don't tell anybody, but it is better to just tell everyone, and then, if you can work your angles and try to get on CNBC, then that's great. But the more that you can just let people know about it, you get your subscribers one at a time. There's no one day that a whole stadium's worth of people is going to find you. I just watched this amazing YouTube video about this YouTuber named Mr. Beast, and I'm sure everybody listening to this has heard of. He's one of the biggest YouTubers. It's very glamorous now. He makes millions of dollars. He's always on the top 10 lists of YouTube. He started when he was a teenager, and he talked about his first videos. They got no views. And then finally he was so excited because he made $1 off a video. That's how he's got his YouTube subscribers one at a time. So everybody just has to go one at a time and use the path that's right for them. Just one story about social media and whether you need it or not. We have a writer on Substack named George Saunders, who is the most famous, well-known, beloved, and respected writing teacher in America. And he, when he came to Substack, he didn't have Twitter. He wasn't on social media. It wasn't easy for us to say, oh, look, he's got 3 million Instagram followers. He's coming to Substack. He's going to do great. If somebody doesn't have social media, it can be opaque as to how well they will do. Well, I will tell you, you go ahead and take a look at his Substack, and you can tell just from the hundreds of comments, he has such an engaged audience for what he's doing because he's known in that field. He's not starting from zero. He had a profile, and his profile, and he was known to be good at it. And so when he started, it just spread like wildfire by word of mouth. So word of mouth can help you too. So, people listening to this might be saying, all right, I don't have a 30-year career of people I know, but it really is, I hate to say a cliche, but that journey does have to start with one step. And it's the people you know who will support you first.
Yeah, it's the hardest part is getting started. So I feel like, to your point, taking the first step, and everyone has a network, right? It's just building that out, and your networks and all of that. It just continuously grows if you stay on it, right? So you can't give up too easily. But I have to ask, with all of this conversation around everyone going out and building their own content and kind of being more entrepreneurial mindset, and seeing that continue to grow, where does this leave traditional media and social media? Because I clearly bias on having a Twitter addiction, like a typical Gen Z, but a lot of my information intake is from my phone. We're living in a digital world. We've seen continued digitization of everything. And I get my news from Twitter and from my phone and from some of those traditional media outlets, but it's either social media or those outlets. So I feel like Reddit could definitely be pretty disruptive in the eyes of that traditional media industry. And I'm sure that they're feeling very threatened by that. So how do you see the future of where they play a role as, this sort of Substack culture and this idea of people going off on their own and not staying within institutions and larger companies to put their thoughts out there? How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, and it's something that we ponder very much within Substack. I think, the conventional big media brands are not going anywhere and serve a function in society for sure. I mean, look at the New York Times. They have gone from strength to strength. They have grown in size and stature, and it's still a place that anybody would love to work. At the same time, there are people who have left the New York Times, notably Bari Weiss, who is now writing on Substack and supremely successful doing so. I think you mentioned the phrase creator economy. If we're in a time when there are more choices and options for people who write to express themselves, that's a very good thing. If we're in an environment where somebody who wants to write about financial topics or has an expertise can choose to work at an investment bank, or he can choose to write on Substack and have his own independent newsletter thing. I think that's fabulous. There actually are more choices, and people don't have to feel like they have to be locked in a perch at an institution. If they wish to have more editorial freedom and life freedom, they can go do something facilitated by technology on their own. So I think that those traditional, I mean, it's so funny me talking about this because I don't know about journalism. I never came from journalism. I work with lots of people who come from either literary cultural backgrounds or journalistic backgrounds, and they would have much more informed thoughts about this. What I can think from looking more at our financial side of it is Barron's, is the Wall Street Journal going to continue to be around? 100%. They're hotbeds of training for young journalists who work there. But are they going to be the only respected choice, or are people going to be able to get their news, informations, opinions from other sources? Well, they already are. Like you said, Twitter is really powerful, and there are going to be novel things coming up. The next new thing that some Gen Z person is going to introduce to me for sure, because it's always from some young person that I hear about it, that is going to be the next social media network that could be exciting and create new stars. It's already on its way. It's being probably funded by a VC as we speak. So I just think that it's good if the writers and creators have more options of where they want to go, what they want to do. Can they be trained up and mentored? Can they have editorial freedom? And that is better than a world where we have a bunch of stolid old brands and their way of doing it is the only way.
For sure. And from having the conversations with a lot of folks, if you're like recruiting for Substack, right? You mentioned people leaving places like the New York Times or other media outlets to start their own Substacks, which I've certainly seen some friends of mine, internet friends of mine from Twitter doing that in large groups, really going off on their own and building something new, and really excited about that. And just, you can see a lot of passion behind what they're doing. This seems pretty renewed versus where they were before, right? So do you think that social media, that was like a direct result of social media in a lot of ways? There's such a community aspect of people sharing their thoughts and views, and the tide is sort of turning on against those more traditional outlets and seeing people go out on their own. Do you think that sort of caused this snowball effect of people seeing someone go off on their own and thinking, oh, I can do that. And it just continuing to go from there.
I think that we are a species that looks for examples around us and observes what others are doing, for sure. And whereas I'm going to sound like our mutual friend, Jim O'Shaughnessy, when I say this, but going back, 100,000 years, when you're around the campfire and you only know 150 people, you're only being influenced by 150 people you know. So you're only copying them and doing what they do. But now you and I can log on to Twitter and be influenced by literally 10,000 people in one day. And we want to do everything they're doing. And, oh, she's baking bread during the pandemic and I want to do that. No, he is seeing this movie and I want to do that. So people can, and especially people within sort of the smaller world of finance and investing Twitter world, are definitely always looking, what are others doing? It's a status conscious world. How are other people getting ahead? And it's also a world of people wanting to learn and, advance and build themselves up intellectually. How can I learn and how can I network? So I think that people are influenced by looking at other people leaving institutions and things like that. I think that people will still do whatever makes sense at the point that they're at in their career. When you talk about leaving, so Matthew Klein, who was at Barron's, he is now on Substack, and he is writing on Substack a publication called The Overshoot, and he talks about economics, macroeconomics, fiscal policy, global issues. And before he worked at Barron's, he was previously at FT. And back in the day, he was a blogger. This is a resurgence of the blogging era. Before, there were just 4 websites where people spent all their time. There used to be hundreds of blogs, and you go and, in sort of the mid 2000s, you would go check out all your different blogs, see what all these different people had to say. So there's really nothing mind-shatteringly novel about going and seeing what people publishing on Substack or other platforms have to say for themselves in their self-controlled publication. It's just bringing it back to that. So somebody like Matthew Klein, he had the opportunity to work within organizations, and then he came to the point where there was an opportunity to come to Substack and just do his own thing and have total control on his own. And it's working very well. If that were 10 years ago in his career, maybe that wouldn't have been the case. So it has to be the right place and time for people. But I'm glad if people are getting influenced to see that it is possible, and that it is possible not just to write online, but to actually have it be something that can support you and support independence and be a career and a lifestyle.
That's such a good point on the blogging, like back in the day as well, like 10, 20 years ago, right? But it's so true. I mean, now, what is it? History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. I mean, we just see resurgence of many things that have been done in the past, but more efficient, more simple to use, more streamlined, you name it, just innovating in a way that takes ideas from the past and just makes them a little bit better and makes people interested in them again. So really good point there. I guess for people who are writing about all kinds of different content, right? How does Substack approach editorial freedom? So, you've seen some large social media platforms like Twitter censoring folks, whether it's misinformation or otherwise. Does Substack, how do you deal with that in terms of the information that's being put out and how that's overseen?
Mm-hmm. So we have a trust and safety policy, and we do have a content moderation policy where there are rules on Substack. For example, plagiarism is not allowed, harassment is not allowed, and it's published on the site, but we have basic standards of behavior, and we're very careful about making sure that those are adhered to. When it comes to content that does not fit those categories, though, Substack has made a stand that we are not going to be the arbiters of what is correct or incorrect. We're a little different. Well, we're a lot different, frankly, than something like a Twitter. When I'm on Twitter, I'm getting tweets rapid fired at me. And if I see something that is offensive to me, it's sort of getting shoved in my face. And it's to Twitter's benefit if I get upset, because then I might react. And now we have a lot of tweets going and a lot of engagement. Isn't it exciting? But on Substack, you only see what you have subscribed to, and you can always hit the unsubscribe button and never see it again. more deeply, if you go on Substack's own blog is on.substack.com. And if anybody wants to know in a little more specific detail about Substack's thoughts about this, I'd invite you to go on, because the three founders of Substack have made a few posts about our attitude towards this, because we have been challenged on this misinformation question. And we have, the founders have come out and we all buy into it, have said, we don't think that it's right for democracy or for our business, for us, the people who run Substack, to sit in judgment of what is correct or incorrect information. It sort of can open you up to a really problematic world where you have a bunch of people around a table deciding what's right or not, and it doesn't really adhere to the principle of free speech. So really, Substack was founded, like I said, with an eye to journalists and with a mindset of the principle of free speech. So that's what we have decided to adhere to. But I always do want to note, it is not a free-for-all, anything goes, nobody ever gets banned. We do have a set of content moderation standards that we adhere to. It's just we're not deciding what's correct and incorrect and taking things down based on that, which is different from Twitter.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I personally love that. I could see how it could be like an area of controversy for people,
Sure.
right? But I mean, if people want to write and they want people to have an audience of people that want to come and pay them for what they're writing, right? I mean, within reason of things that are not completely out of left field and completely absurd, to a point. And I feel like most of us would be able to understand what that is and isn't at some point. I mean, who's to stop them, right? I mean, the audience is there willingly. It's not on a completely open forum where anyone can see it and be offended and have conversations that continue to just like snowball and get bigger and bigger until they get into massive Twitter fights that people are talking about and whatnot. So I think that's sort of interesting. And do you see that being the future of content creation? Really? I know that, and I agree with this, there will always be a place for traditional media, and that's never going to go away. I think that there's a way for new innovations in the space to live in harmony with the more traditional players. Mm-hmm. But do you see a continued shift towards, I mean, I work in crypto, right? So the whole idea of decentralization and not having the intermediaries that are overseeing all of this in a lot of regards and things. Do you see that happening on the writing front as well?
Well, it's tough to say. The question of decentralization is a really fascinating one. And I think out of the crypto world, we are going to see new models of sharing and new models of how you fund things, for example. If we could all get together and use tokens, and the purchase of those tokens would fund somebody to write an essay or do a creative project. There has been, and you have seen, a lot of very interesting solutions like that. And it's because people are just looking for, how can I make something financially viable so that it can support me as an artist or a writer? So it is a time enabled by technology of tremendous creativity around how to do these things. At the same time, it's like you said, history repeating. It is the same sort of enlightenment or Renaissance, I should say, model of, I'm going to have a patron of my art. So somebody will come and pay me, but we're just doing it in a decentralized, technologically enabled, very online way. So I think you will see more of that, especially because of the end of the monoculture. When I was a kid, when I was a teenager growing up watching sitcoms and things like that, everybody would watch Friends. Everybody would watch the season finale of ER, and you'd go into work and everybody would be talking about the same thing because it was, sort of an 8-channel world. Now it's very different. People are splintered into their individual communities. It's the endless scroll on Netflix. And, I might have this sliver of things that I'm interested in, and I might be able to find 10,000 people on the internet who are interested in that. And I might be able to have a successful Substack on my very narrow interest, but we have lost sort of having a small set of unifying things that everybody knows about. So I think that splintering lends itself to the sort of, this is very optimistic, but sort of an explosion of creativity and thinking about ways to fund that creativity, because it's no longer like, okay, culture is a huge movie like Avatar that gets Hollywood funded and then everybody sees, and that's what popular culture is. Popular culture now is we're in the long tail where there's more of a diffusion and disruption, and that's good for platforms like Substack, because guess what? If you want to make 10 Substacks about your 10 different interests, you can. It's there's zero cost of entry because of technology to set things up now. So again, it's a lot easier than when you had to, photocopy your zines at Kinko's and mail them out. Now you can do it. There's just a lower barrier to entry.
Yeah. And that goes back to what you were saying before about people seeing a lot of success on Substack in those niche areas, right? Because people today have a short attention span. We want the optionality, and Substack and other platforms like it lend to that, right? I mean, there's not only one place to go to get your information. There are almost too many, arguably, where it's hard to find sometimes. So if there are people who are specifically dialing in on different areas, then they stand out a lot more than the people who are covering more generalist topics. So I mean, to your point, yeah, there's just so much information out there. People want the optionality. It's what we expect. And it's easier to kind of dial in on the right audience by being a little bit more specific in what you're writing about, because there's so much content out there at the end of the day.
And when you have a specialist publication, you can go as deep as you want. Like if you flip open the Wall Street Journal and read their macroeconomics coverage, it's going to be in language that the educated layperson can understand. And if somebody is writing at the Wall Street Journal and they start to really wonk out and want to put links to white papers and things like that, their editor will probably tell them, okay, calm down. We have to make this accessible for our educated but general audience. Well, if you have a publication of your own, I'm thinking about some of the macroeconomics writers on Substack. There's a writer named John Turek who writes a Substack called Cheap Convexity, and he goes very, very deep into the Fed and interest rates. And he does macro at such a deeper level, just a very sophisticated level that you're never going to read in the Wall Street Journal. And he can do that because he's not trying to make something that necessarily anybody with an MBA can understand. He's only for the wonk nerds. So the wonk nerds go crazy for it, So there's a lot of merit to being able to say what I'm doing is not for everybody. There are plenty of Substacks about crypto or about NFTs where I try to read them. I don't understand one word that they're saying, but it's because they don't care about me. They're not talking to me. They're not talking to somebody who it's their first day learning about crypto. They're talking to somebody who already has a MetaMask account, right? So, and they can afford to be a little deeper within the niche, and they're successful that way. So I think that's great.
And with the startup cost, to your point that you mentioned before, being virtually nothing, right? To put information online these days, I mean, they can take those risks, and they can also say, this is the audience that I'm catering towards, and anyone else, I'm not going to kind of bend to your will because I have a limited ability to bring in new readers, right? I mean, social media and the internet and how that has continued to expand has sort of eliminated that in a lot of ways. So especially in specific areas like that, I mean, there's so many rabbit holes that you can go down. And on the traditional side of things, I have a friend at Bloomberg, even we were just talking about on the ETF side of things. I think they just relaunched ETF IQ, and he was excited to be able to see people going in depth about that topic, because a lot of the time who you're speaking to is more generalist audience that you don't have the ability to do that anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a great example, because that's another topic area where you have a meaningful group of people who have a ton of education about it, are very knowledgeable, and don't need you to restate the basics. So have a product that is a premium priced product where you don't restate the basics. And the other cool thing with going deep and more niche is that, and I know you mentioned about a short attention span. People have a short attention span for superficial, trivial information. When I'm reading a tweet, maybe I get halfway through the tweet and I get bored and I scroll, but that's because I'm operating intellectually at a superficial level. There's this whole genre on YouTube of video essays. And like some of them are half an hour long. And everybody says, oh, young people don't want to concentrate. They just want to be on TikTok and have it be 30 seconds. Somebody is giving them millions upon millions of views to these long, detailed video essays that are about things like, how the Federal Reserve works. So there's a craving for information, and good information delivered, not in a puerile, juvenile way, but in a way that engages. And I think the proof is it's storytelling. Storytelling never changes. You have to figure out the arc of the story. It has to have a beginning, middle, and end. It has to be coherent. It's better if there are people in it. All of those classic things that have existed since Shakespeare. If you take the storytelling art and put it into whether it's a podcast, a video, or a Substack essay, people are going to travel along with you. And I've had Substack writers tell me that their very long posts actually get the most positive response and the most signups, which was completely counterintuitive to my expectation. I thought that posts that are sort of a 2-minute read that somebody can read in line while they're waiting for their sandwich for lunch is going to get the best response and be the most read. But actually something that it might be because when the writer has the gumption to write something long and in depth is something that he or she has deeply thought about, has experience with, has done research. They pore over their sources and they polish it until it's like a gem. And then they put it out into the world and it gets some traction. So I thought that was interesting. And that's for anybody listening who's kind of looking for tips about what to do with their own online writing. If you usually write short, try writing longer. If you usually write super long, try breaking it up into 4 pieces. Like in any business, experimentation is the watchword because you don't know what your audience is going to do until you test them.
That's such a great point too. I guess it's too much of a blanket statement to say that the attention spans have shortened. I just think that probably with the amount of information that's out there, people are going to be interested in the areas that interest them most, right? The short attention span is probably going to be for the more general things that you're seeing online that are put in front of you constantly. But the things that are well done, the things that are very well thought out, well written and articulate to areas that people do want to read about, they're going to take the time. It's just a little bit more particular because they have the optionality to kind of opt in or opt out of anything that they see. And on the way of storytelling, right? I think that we've seen even in the past 10 years, there's just been such a rise of whether it's YouTube, TikTok, Vine, when that existed, people are putting information out in so many different ways these days, not just, I'm definitely a newsletter fan, but I know that people like to absorb their information in different ways. Does Substack have plans to expand upon beyond newsletters, or are you kind of going to continue to be catering to written word rather than, we've seen a lot of people on videos and audio as well?
So I think when the founders launched Substack and wanted to, every startup has to have sort of a simplified version of what it is to compel people. So, this is Airbnb is Uber for hotels or whatever, cliche. So Substack used email newsletters. It's an easy way to make an email newsletter, but really it does. Just as you've intuited, it goes beyond the newsletter because it is really a platform where you can do and create whatever you wish. Substack does have audio, and there are people who are doing podcast first Substacks. The benefit of taking now I'll do a little pitch to anybody listening who has a podcast, or even this podcast you may want to put on Substack. The benefit of doing a podcast on Substack, you can host it on Substack and populate it out to the platforms with RSS feed, just like you do on Podbean or Anchor, but you are organizing it around the email list. So rather than being in the melee of all of the other podcasts that people are subscribed to on Spotify or whatever, when you put out a new version of your podcast, it goes to your email list and they get in their inbox, a very intimate, very personal notification that you have a new episode. The other thing that's attractive is that just like with Substack newsletters, where you can put some free available to everybody and some behind the paywall, you can put podcast episodes behind the paywall on Substack. So for example, there's a podcast called Blocked and Reported that is by 2 journalists named Katie Herzog and Jesse Singal, and they are on Substack. And what they do is have some episodes that, again, are just published free for everybody, but other ones that are only for their paying subscribers. And because it's a Substack post, their subscribers can go and put comments underneath, and they have a very entertaining comment section. It's very different than on Twitter because somebody can't just come and troll you. The CEO of Substack, Chris Best, he says people may hate follow you on Twitter, but nobody will hate pay to read you on Substack. So anybody who's commenting, who's one of their paying subscribers, they're there for fun and they're there to learn and there to be entertained and have a good time. So it's a very pleasant commenting experience. So you can have a podcast on Substack and people do. It also gives you the freedom you've got your show notes underneath. Some people do entire transcripts, which is really good for SEO. People can Google and find you. And then the other question is video. So we currently have video in beta on Substack, and we have it enabled. Whenever we do anything at Substack, we always want the writers to test it and try it and give us feedback and give us criticism a lot before it goes out to the general public. So when we when we released our app, which is just a week ago, we had hundreds of Substack writers beta testing the app for months before it went out to the general public. It's like a miracle that it didn't leak everywhere all over Twitter, but they were testing it. So the video right now, and I think the video testing, here's some inside baseball. It's going very well. It's giving people the ability to put video in a Substack post, and the video is natively hosted on Substack. So what people had been doing is you could upload a YouTube video and then you could embed that in a Substack post, and that works fine. You have video, people can watch it, but having it be native hosted on Substack is better because there's no YouTube branding. You don't have to worry about an ad showing up. It's just your stuff. And that's what Substack is all about, just your stuff. So I am interested. I'm excited to see how creators, we're back to that word creators. I know of no better word that is a big umbrella word for all these people, right? Because we're not just talking about writers. Somebody, if they're a podcast for Substacks, I'm expecting at some point we're going to see video for Substacks where people say, well, the way that I create is with video. And so maybe I've been on YouTube, but I'd like to come and do Substack, and then I can have some stuff behind a paywall. I can ask people to support me. They get extras. It's going to be the creators themselves who come up with the creative and interesting ways that this tool is used. It's not going to be me who works at Substack. It's going to be them.
Right. And it's just listening to your audience, right? You want to make sure you're adding in the features that the people that work with you want before, bringing that out to the world. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And I want to be, conscious of your time and everything. So do you want to wrap this up? But I always ask people the same thing at the end of the podcast, nothing too crazy, but outside of writer recruitment for Substack and being on podcasts and tweeting that I follow sometimes as well. What do you like to do with your free time? What do you do outside of that?
Oh, you would laugh, but I like sewing. So do you sew at all, by the way?
I actually do.
Oh my gosh. Okay. We can talk.
I haven't in a while,
this.
But I used to a ton when I was younger.
So I used to sew a ton also when I was younger, and I used to sew clothing, but so you understand and can appreciate this. Sewing clothing is incredibly time consuming and so persnickety, and you have all your stuff laid out everywhere and you're like stepping over pins and everything. So now my sewing is more towards crafting and doing things like make a tote bag or make a headband and stuff like that. But it's really, and I'm sure you've had other people tell you this, I feel like if you have work that is very mental and you're in front of a screen all day and you're solving problems, it's very intense. It's nice to have two hobbies that you do. One hobby that's very physical and just gets you out of that, and it makes you sweat and you can't really think about anything because you're exhausting yourself and you kind of need to do that, otherwise you'll die. And then the other one to be more with your hands. And with the cool thing with sewing, and again, you'll appreciate, you're working with patterns and fabric and color. And it's like, okay, now I'm not trying to think about how do I convince someone of something in this intense way. I'm thinking about, do these colors look good together? So it's cool to have a hobby that is just gives you a bit of a chance to be creative and artistic and has absolutely no chance of making any money. Like when I'm doing that, I'm not thinking I'm going to sell this at a craft fair or something. I'm just doing it just for fun and just for like self-expression and to get out of work mode. So that's really cool that you also like sewing, and you're one of the few people who can appreciate the frustrations that can go along with the joy of it.
Oh, definitely. And I think it's an important point too. It's, even when you love what you do, right? It's great to do something that's a lot more relaxing and something that's completely takes your mind off of it. So that's painting for me these days, but
cool.
did used to like sewing a lot as well. So maybe I'll bring that back after this podcast, but
you never know. You can, with hobbies, you can put something down for years and years and then pick it up again. That's what I've found in my life. And if you enjoy it, it always stays within you, and it's like, it's a resource to tap. So it's cool.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, I'm going to look into that now, but thank you so much for being on today. This was fantastic. I'd love to come back at some point, but for those listening, where can they follow you for some of your musings, and where can they, hopefully someone listening to this will be interested in getting started on Substack, hopefully several people. Where do they go to inquire about more information for that?
Well, they should 100% go to substack.com and they should click on start writing, and then they're going to have a Substack in 30 seconds. The podcast is for women, and it's, chicks. So if anybody is listening and is a woman and is thinking, I wonder if I could do a Substack and start a Substack. Yes, you can. go look at the leaderboards. There are women who are top Substack writers in every category. I want to shout out Geneviève Roche-Decter, who's from right here in Toronto, who has Grit Capital. It's one of the top finance Substacks. Absolutely great read. So subscribe to her to be inspired. And if you want to go to substack.com, if you want to follow me on Twitter, it's Substack Linda. I do have open DMs. So if anyone is listening to this and has a question or is thinking, is it for me? Or maybe you started a Substack and you want some resources that we have, feel free to DM me. Like I'm very, very open to that. Where Substack is we're still growing as a company, and my job is all about things that don't scale. Like I'm one person trying to explain this to people and trying to recruit people. So people shouldn't have any hesitation to reach out. It's another thing that's going to, if we're David against the Goliath of the huge social media companies, having better customer support and having actual people that can be reached out to, we think is going to be a point of advantage. So yeah, that's where people can find me.
Love it. Well, thank you so much. I'm excited to kind of follow along with Substack and all that you and the rest of your team are building there. And thank you so much to everyone for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode.